Section 7 of The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 7. That night, Batson, 3,000 miles distant, sat drowsing and dreaming over a dirty, torn, printed sheet, sensing in his misty yet strangely accurate way the course of the operations of which he had no evidence. Drowsed and dreamed far into the night, almost unconscious of the dull roar of the millions holding high revel in every main artery of London town. An unwonted, sudden chilliness drew him from his reverie, and, rising, he moved to the wide open window and stood a little while, sniffing thoughtfully and happily at the pleasant, cool air, then muttered aloud, "I say, it's damn cool. Must be a change on the way. Thank the gods. Me for the hay and real sleep tonight." And, yawning, he abruptly closed the squeaking sash, the first time it had been moved for nearly 4 grilling, tragic weeks. Dawn, his work at the factory had turned him into an early riser, found him fanning a little fire of chips and small coal, no more than sufficient to boil a little kettle in which lay the pallid leaves of the previous day's brewing of tea. As the blaze spread its sinuous fingers amid the fuel, he suddenly realized that he had his hands spread before it with the pose of one who finds the trifling warmth grateful. Moreover, he noted that his fingers possessed a hint of that bluey tone so common in the dreary short days. "Cripes, I believe I'm cold. What the deuce is wrong?" he exclaimed in astonishment, as his gaze wandered from the fire to the window, and there it rested for a moment, for the glass was clouded with condensed moisture, evidencing the low temperature of the outside air. "Phew! What?" he ejaculated, and striding to the window he threw up the lower sash. The window faced to the west, and no touch of the newly risen sun had fallen upon it as yet, or upon the moribund narrow box of unhealthy-looking soil which lay on the ledge. A solitary, stunted, and grim-laden geranium hibernated in this receptacle, possibly because it lacked the vitality to accomplish the feat of expiring. The leaves had drooped even lower than usual, and upon each mournful surface there lay a thin but undeniable coating of white hoar-frost. "Well, I'm blowed! It's a frost! Who ever heard of a frost in August?" he muttered aloud, as he stretched out his hand and gently felt one of the whitened leaves. The coating instantaneously dissolved into moisture, but moisture that the Ice King had breathed upon. For a little space Batson gazed upon it, curiously watching its white virginity vanish in the rapidly warming atmosphere, and then, still pondering, returned to his miserable breakfast. And such was his reception of the earliest frost ever known in the British Isles south of the Tweed, a frost which accomplished, in a few hours, results which the entire human species had, up to its coming, failed most dismally to effect. Early in the day, strange rumors of a miraculous debacle which had overtaken the swarming terrible invaders of the land passed from one man to another. Before noon these rumors were lifted from the category of mere sourceless hearsay to the dignity of substantiated fact. Again the huge bulletin board sent the pulse of the masses throbbing with the thrill of the news they imparted, telling of the fearful growths all over the country, now lying still and lifeless, slain in a moment by the chill breath of the phenomenal frost. Singly, in colonies, in frightful huge communities, they lay dead everywhere. There was no doubt of the fact. The news had not been made public until verified from 100 widely separated points. It was no mere local phenomenon, or even confined to the British Isles. From central France, Germany, and the great Slavonic plateau, right to the Arctic Circle, the frost, with more or less rigor, had descended. It was assumed that either these extraordinary organisms had never in their progenitors been subjected to such reduction in the temperature, or else, partaking of the nature of our annual flora at the approach of winter, their structure suffered a similar decay and dissolution, to reappear only in their descendants, having previously thrown abroad the contents of their seed containers. Possibly the temperature in their planet of origin was more stable, and the year many times the length of ours. However, the great and main fact was that the visitation had swept the country practically clear of the horrible things, though in certain protected localities a few isolated individuals might still exist. The pinnacle of the crises had been reached. On the very edge of extinction, the British people had been succored. A small percentage did, indeed, fail to survive the hardships of malnutrition and consequent depressed vitality, but, for the great majority, the encircling belt of terrible life was pierced in the nick of time. It occurred at Southampton. Here the efforts of the nation had been concentrated. For one thing, it was the logical point for the rapid handling of freight, and, for another, the narrow channel between the Isle of Wight and the mainland was alone at the entrance subjected to the inpouring of the incalculable millions of growths composing the stupendous drift. In this channel was deposited the greater part of the bacterial culture, which was rushed across the Atlantic in less than 3 days after the first cable had been received. Over 500 vessels were at the time in the English Channel, mostly anchored in certain shallow stretches, for never a breath of air had ruffled the water for the last 3 weeks. Practically all of them had left their distant home ports previous to the abrupt appearance of the frightful invasion, and by the time they reached these waters, every port within their fuel radius had been closed. In their holds they held the foodstuffs, for the lack of which millions were on the verge of extinction. Efforts had indeed been made to transfer a portion of their cargoes to land by fleets of aircraft, but the endeavor, though persisted in, was a failure to any practical extent, for the largest planes could not transport more than a few tons at a time, and it was a most difficult and lengthy business to load them, even with this trifling cargo. The great dirigibles were entirely too clumsy for the work, therefore the total results to date had been inappreciable. These vessels were now gathered in the vicinity of the port in readiness to make any daring move, should there prove to be the least chance of success. Men now, as in the World War, gave no heed to their lives if the great objective could be forwarded by their loss. It was an inspiring yet nerve-wracking sight for the vast crowds who were watching from the low hills and coastline which confine that channel. As far as the eye could reach beyond the 5-mile-wide belt of heavy abomination, there were ships in lines and squadrons, south, east, and west, ships of every size and dimension, Levantine tubs of 1,000 tons or less, laden with dried fruits and 100 luxuries, mammoth American cattle and grain carriers, Australian and South American ships, filled to the hatches with scores of thousands of frozen and chilled cattle and sheep, though an increasing number of these had daily been dumped overboard as fuel ran shorter and shorter. Hardly a vessel but held in its bowels the lives of thousands of starving, desperate humanity. In 24 hours the effect of that deadly culture was plainly visible to the distant throngs. The entire channel was a strip of brilliant scarlet, and hourly it was extending to the masses adjacent, to the Glencamus Castle, 5,000-ton grain carrier of the Kincaid line, fell the honor of being the first craft to pierce that 5-mile wide belt of horrible life. Many times it had seemed as though the attempt would be futile and the screws become fouled. But with safety valves recklessly weighted, they burst through the dying masses at the entrance to the channel and steamed into the scarlet stretch of the already dead growths. Other craft were close behind, and before the channel closed again, through the blind surge of the immense pressure from the open sea, a score of great vessels had run the gauntlet and drawn into the docks, where for days thousands of men had striven to clear the huge ridge of putrefying things which were piled 20 feet high on the wharves. And in a little the plague could be seen working among this fresh inpouring and spreading rapidly in the great belt outside. At once the news was flashed to every center of the civilized world, and the despair and chaos of the nations was changed in a moment to a delirium of elation, and aircraft by the hundred were madly driven at undreamt of speeds, transporting the precious little packages of infection in every direction. A little later, in scores of ports, great vessels hurled their thousands of tons at full speed into the stricken things. Many found themselves surrounded by the myriads not yet affected, and were overwhelmed by them, even as those doomed ships of weeks before had been. But the individual no longer weighed in the balance when every minute was priceless. Everywhere vessels staggered through the drift and brought life and hope to the starving millions, and everywhere the deadly little bacilli were spreading and speeding like a forest fire through the enormous mass of alien life, changing it in a few short hours to mere putrefying scum. And thus passed the most terrible menace which man so far had striven with. He triumphed, but the margin between him and total extinction had been well nigh imperceptible. As it was, before winter had set in, the phosphorans had practically completed its deadly work, and only in a few secluded islands did the marine growths linger. On land, too, it was shortly discovered that the same ally was as virulent an enemy of the terrestrial types as it was to the marine, and the remnants left by the preceding cold snap were quickly exterminated. For now the whole world was centered on this business, and nations needed neither treaties or commissions to render aid wherever it was required. Though there could be little doubt but there would be sudden outbreaks of these fearful things for many years to come, yet man had the assurance that now he had a weapon capable of overcoming the menace of this marvelous vitality and stupendous power of propagation. That such a huge volume of decay could encompass our coasts and lay the land under the blight of its fearful stench, without most serious results ensuing, was not possible. The reek of that filthy, putrefying multitude was beyond words. While in no manner similar to the stench of decay we associate with the process, yet it possessed an irritant and sickening quality many times more distressing and incredibly penetrating. There was no escaping it. It hung over the land and water as an almost visible pall, and tainted every scrap of food and drop of water with its nauseating properties. That sickness should sweep the world was inevitable, and, considering the low ebb of vitality then prevalent, it was nothing short of a miracle that the toll of life was no more. A mere 5% of the European population. On the American side the mortality was considerably less, fell a prey to what became commonly known as the green rot. That it was a hitherto unknown variety of plague was the sole explanation the masses ever assimilated. The symptoms were the appearance of greenish blotches upon the abdomen and chest. These rapidly spread, and became decomposed areas of rotting flesh, boring like ulcers into the vital organs and causing intense agony. A great variance in the susceptibility of individuals to its virulence was the most extraordinary feature of the occurrence. Many expired within a few hours, practically rotted masses of corruption. Others suffered a little space in great agony, then the symptoms abated, and in a few days the patient was as sound as ever. If one survived 24 hours, recovery was assured. No more than this fact was ever definitely agreed upon, and no antidote was discovered. However, like all human ills, this strange visitation ran its course and passed away. Winter and the ceaseless violent gales which sweep the northern seas at that season, in the course of time dispersed the slime and corruption from the water, and the great wall of death, which had encompassed thousands of miles of coastline from the Mediterranean to the Arctic, so that by the spring naught remained of all that enormous host, save the memory that time itself could never efface. It was a humbled and sobered humanity that emerged from the ordeal. The proud conceit of their vaunted progress no longer swayed the nations, and man forgot his former dream of some future day scaling the gulf which separates him from the neighboring heavenly bodies. Rather was there a dread that the inhabitants of these worlds might again, through a similar mischance, leap that gulf and arrive to wreak their merciless will upon our planet. The old order of assured dominance and pride of the stability and security of the species had been shattered, and humanity became more reverent and humble. The antagonisms of race, so fiercely maintained in former days, were largely obliterated by the realization that, faced by a common foe, boundary lines and commercial jealousies had, in a twinkling, vanished, and mankind awoke to the fact that north, south, east, and west, the human race was but a single family, isolated in the immensity of creation. A truer sense of proportion came to the world, and the insanity of slaying one's neighbor, who might well tomorrow be one's salvation, was borne upon all men. Not that bickerings or wars ceased, but anger was neither so hasty or prolonged, and the intense bitterness toward an opponent, which had previously swept the entire world into a mad carnival of murder, was now an impossibility. As in the mass, so in the individual, the mental outlook had undergone a radical change. One likes to think of Batson deserting his desk and invertebrate existence for the whir of a cyclopean lathe, which daily in his hands gave to the world a lasting monument of the fact that once a living man had fulfilled the object of his being and left his fellows the richer for his presence. End of section 7. End of The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis.